There is something very special about keeping poison dart frogs. Designing and creating your very own ecosystem for them, watching them living their lives in it, and eventually getting them to breed. I've been a part of this wonderful hobby for the past 6 years of my life, and it has truly given me so much joy. I currently keep 8 different dart frog species in 17 vivariums and have raised around 200 froglets. This video will be a complete comprehensive guide to dart frog keeping for beginners. My goal is to make it as broad and thorough as possible to cover absolutely everything you need to know to successfully keep dart frogs. This video will be split into 5 main segments, with each segment being divided into a few chapters. First, I will give you a general introduction to poison dart frogs. Then I will talk about the vivarium essentials, such as the vivarium size, lighting requirements and misting systems. Next, I will talk about setting up the vivarium, including the background, substrate, planting and much more. The penultimate segment will be about the day-to-day care and husbandry, and the final part will be about choosing and acquiring the frogs themselves. You can use the chapters on the video timeline to easily navigate through the different parts of the video, in case there is a chapter that you want to skip or watch again. With all of that said, get your notebooks ready, because you're about to earn a degree in dart frog husbandry. Segment 1. Introduction. 1.1. General Introduction. Poison dart frogs, or Dendrobatidae, is a family of frogs native to South and Central America. As the name implies, some species are very poisonous, and the poison of a few species from the Phyllobates genus has even been used by indigenous tribes to create poisonous arrows. But the interesting part is that they derive this poison from various arthropods in their wild diet. In captivity, dart frogs are completely harmless, since they're fed a diet that lacks the alkaloids they use to produce their poison. I still wouldn't recommend eating them though. Many species have a beautiful aposematic coloration to ward off predators, and a single species can have extremely different colors and patterns in different populations from different geographical regions in the wild, so-called localities. Dart frogs are diurnal, meaning that they are active during the day, and the males have a call to attract females or indicate territories. The call varies greatly in sound and volume between different species, all the way from the almost completely quiet buzzing noise of Dendrobates tinctorius to the high-pitched call of Epipedobates anthonii. Luckily for us, they mostly call during the day though. Many dart frog species and localities have a very limited distribution range in the wild and are threatened or endangered because of habitat destruction, but most species are very easy to breed in captivity, to the point where captive bred frogs entirely outcompete the black market of smuggled animals. 1.2. Are dart frogs difficult to keep? Whether dart frogs are difficult to keep as pets is a two-sided question to answer. On the one hand, they require a very well planned out bioactive vivarium that will be sustainable in the long run. It takes a while to do research and get the enclosure right, and you will most likely end up doing some beginner mistakes in your first setup that you have to fix. Impulse buying dart frogs without an enclosure ready as a beginner is a really bad idea. On the other hand, once the vivarium is up and running, it will require very little maintenance and mostly take care of itself. The main tasks are to feed the frogs, which only takes a few minutes per day, and possibly mist the enclosure if you don't have an automatic misting system. Perhaps the biggest reason people hesitate to get into dart frogs is the food, since you pretty much have to culture fruit flies for them, and preferably some other feeder insects too. In my opinion, this isn't that bad, as it only takes me around 20 minutes every other week to make new fruit fly cultures, and the flies require no maintenance besides that. But if you are careless with the routine or you don't manage to get good production in your cultures, it can get quite stressful. 1.3. Are dart frogs the right pets for you? Keeping dart frogs is a lot like keeping fish. They are very active and fun to watch, but they are definitely not animals you should handle unless it's absolutely necessary due to their sensitive skin. Many people have compared the vibe of it to keeping saltwater reef tanks, except it's much cheaper and easier. The fact that the frogs are active during the day is also a huge bonus for me, and if you ask me, culturing feeder insects isn't too big of a burden, but I can certainly see why some people feel differently about that. Dart frogs are not for everyone, but they are the perfect pets for the keeper who thinks it's just as fun to set up a nice vivarium as it is to keep the animals themselves. In general, the husbandry standard within the dart frog hobby is much higher than the average in the reptile hobby, because a well-planned, planted, bioactive setup is basically a necessity, and the recommended vivarium sizes within the dart frog community are rather large. Segment 2. Vivarium Essentials. 2.1. Vivarium size. The minimum vivarium size to keep poison dart frogs in is generally considered to be somewhere around a 45 cm or 18 inch cube, though I would say that adding a bit of extra height to make it 45 by 45 by 60 cm or 18 by 18 by 24 inches makes it far easier to escape and plant. In general, bigger is always better, though I will also say that once you're completely new to vivarium creation, I would honestly advise against starting with a massive tank, since it's nicer getting all of your beginner mistakes done in a 60 cm tank that you can easily redo, rather than a 1.5 meter tank. In my opinion, it is acceptable to keep a pair of thumbnail frogs, such as a Ranitomea or Epipedobedes, in a 30 by 30 by 45 cm or 12 by 12 by 18 inch vivarium too. But that is if and only if it is expertly planted and scaped to utilize the space to the fullest extent, so the frogs can feel safe and secure in there. However, it's much more difficult to create and maintain a good dart frog setup in such a small tank, especially if you're new to the hobby. Some keepers also think that 10-gallon aquariums are acceptable even for larger frogs, but I personally disagree. If you can increase the depth of your vivariums, do it, because it makes it far easier to plant them in a dynamic way, especially for small vivariums. I have some vivariums for thumbnail frogs which are 30 cm wide by 50 cm deep, which is certainly in the smaller range, but they are so much better than a 50 wide by 30 deep tank would be, since the latter would feel flat like a canvas in comparison and significantly restrict the frog's opportunity to retreat into the back half of the tank and feel safe. The number of frogs you can keep in each vivarium varies depending on how well the species in question does in groups, because some are territorial and work best in pairs almost regardless of vivarium size, while others can easily be kept in groups without issues, and some are sort of in between. I will talk more about group housing for specific species later in the video. What I've just said goes for permanently housing adult dart frogs. Juveniles can be kept in smaller vivariums, and you can keep significantly more frogs per area unit, since juveniles are not really territorial in the same way that adults are. I often keep 5 to 10 juveniles in 30 cm or 12 inch tanks for the first few months of their lives. 2.2. Vivarium type and ventilation. All of my vivariums are front opening tanks. The alternative would be using a modified aquarium that you open at the top. I personally really dislike using aquariums, and I dismantled the one I had after a while since it was quite difficult to maintain and the glass kept fogging up, but some keepers liked the undisturbed view you get from only having a single glass pane at the front, and the decreased risk of frogs jumping out and escaping during maintenance. There are two main alternatives when it comes to front opening tanks. The best option is probably a so-called Euro-style tank, which is a sliding door vivarium model that has a strip of ventilation at the top and a horizontal strip of ventilation at the front, below the front glass. The front ventilation prevents the glass from fogging up and creates cross ventilation, but the ventilation is still limited enough to maintain a high humidity. High quality Euro-style tanks are not always common, and you might have to build them yourself or order them. A more commonly available alternative is to use tanks from a brand such as Exoterra or Sumed. These also have front ventilation, though it's black and vertical, so it does disturb the view a bit. However, they have a major issue, which is a full screen mesh top. Dart frogs want a high humidity environment, but with our dry indoor climate, it becomes borderline impossible to maintain such a high humidity level with that much ventilation. As soon as the humidity rises, the humid air will blow out and be replaced with our dry indoor air. The result? You have to mist the tank extremely often, so much that the substrate and the whole environment on the ground risks becoming soaking wet, which, as you will hear later, is not good, but the humidity will still barely rise and the top half of the tank will dry out quickly. To fix this, we have to modify the top of the vivarium to restrict the ventilation so we can maintain the moisture balance more easily. Modifying the top of an Exoterra is super easy. All you need is some aquarium silicone, 2 panes of float glass, and a strip of stainless steel mesh, and the whole process will be done in a matter of minutes. Once you remove the screen mesh lid, you will see this little plastic ledge that the lid was resting on. Simply apply some silicone to it and lay down the 2 pieces of float glass on top of this ledge. You want to have a gap of about 3 to 10 centimeters, depending on the vivarium size, between the 2 glass panes. Now add some more silicone and put the mesh in place. You might have to temporarily place down some small rocks to keep the mesh in place for the first few minutes if it has previously been bent and tries to go back to that shape, but it will not be needed for long because of all the friction from the silicone. Then you just have to let the silicone cure. You can sometimes also cover the top mesh with plastic instead of replacing it entirely, but keep in mind that up until a few years ago, Exoterra didn't use stainless steel in their lids, so if you're using an old Exoterra, the mesh will probably rust if there is any condensation on it. I highly recommend modifying it properly from the start, rather than doing the quick and easy short-term solution of covering it with plastic, and in every tank where I haven't modified it completely, I have regretted not doing so. Speaking of ventilation, fans can sometimes be convenient to prevent the front glass from fogging up and increase the ventilation in otherwise poorly ventilated enclosures, such as modified aquariums. It is entirely possible to keep dart frogs in plastic bins, as long as they are properly set up and have some ventilation. Having a few planted plastic bins as backup tanks is a great idea, in case you need to isolate a certain frog or need a temporary enclosure. However, we usually keep our frogs because they are beautiful and we want to look at them, so I only really use plastic bins for temporary housing, raising froglets, or for frog species that I'm breeding and have several different groups of. 2.3. Lighting. Dart frogs don't really have strict lighting requirements. I always use lights which are around 6500 Kelvin, which is cold white light that resembles daylight. This is all the plants need to grow well, and it showcases the colors of the frogs and plants properly. I use some random 6500 Kelvin E27 bulbs from a Swedish website that has all kinds of lights, which are way cheaper than most lights intended for plants or animals. I usually put these bulbs in Exoterra compact tops. In general, if the light is super intense, it actually tends to make the frogs more shy, and they like having shady places to stay underneath plants and branches throughout the tank, but of course I am by no means saying that you should have dim light either. Some species from the Ophaga genus allegedly benefit from low-level UVB exposure according to some keepers, but all that I've seen is anecdotal evidence. It is objectively not necessary, and many breeders are very successful without it. You can consider adding a low-output UVB light, but it is extremely important that you do proper research about it, since you can cause issues by having a too high UV index, as the light levels in the rainforest understory where they live are relatively low. 2.4. Misting system. I recommend using a misting system for your vivarium to maintain the humidity. It is also possible to hand mist your vivariums daily instead, at least if the ventilation is rather limited, but it is not always optimal. I recommend going for a high quality system, even though it might be a bit more expensive, rather than choosing the cheapest one you can find, since it will be much more flexible and you will usually save money in the long run. For example, Exoterra system often breaks within 6 months or so, and the pressure you get in the nozzles is usually very bad compared to other systems. The most internationally common high quality alternative seems to be Mist King, but I use the system from Dusk Tropics instead, which is more common here in Sweden. A fogger, which produces a more long-term fog rather than a cloud of rain, is different from a misting system and is not necessary or particularly useful. In fact, dense fog can make it difficult for the frogs to breathe, and you will often see them sitting with their mouths wide open or trying to climb the glass to escape the dense fog. Having a fogger producing some light fog for aesthetic purposes might be fine if it doesn't fill up the entire vivarium, but it's not necessary and doesn't replace misting. 2.5. Temperature. The optimal temperature to keep your dart frogs in is usually somewhere in the range of 20 to 24 degrees Celsius or 68 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. There are certain species that prefer it slightly colder or hotter, so do some research on the specific species you plan on buying, but I can say that 99% of dart frog keepers keep all of their frogs in the same room without major temperature differences. For most of us, that is around room temperature, and in general, you can say that if you're comfortable with the temperature in the room, the frogs are too, unless you're a crazy person. There will of course be temperature variations in different microclimates throughout the tank, with the foliage being colder and more humid than the area right beneath the lights, and the lights will often produce a bit of excess heat. It's very uncommon that you have to heat up your dart frog vivarium, but it is possible to use a heat source like a heat mat to raise the temperature a few degrees, if you make really sure that it doesn't get too hot either. If the temperature exceeds 27 degrees Celsius or 80 degrees Fahrenheit, at least for longer periods of time, it can be dangerous, so the summer months can be difficult if you have a room that gets really warm. During the summer, having an air conditioner or a really good fan in the room is incredible, both for you and your frogs. Having blinds or an awning over the windows of the room to block out the sunlight is also very useful. 2.6. Water. Given that amphibians are highly dependent on water and have a sensitive and permeable skin, using safe water in your vivarium is of utmost importance. Most keepers have a reverse osmosis system to treat the water they use in their vivariums. This is to remove calcium and thereby avoid calcium stains on the glass, and to get rid of chemicals such as chlorine and chloramine in the tap water. It's also possible to use spring water or distilled water, and I think there are also products like ReptiSafe that can be used to treat the water for such chemicals. I personally use tap water, but that's because we have our own well, so the water isn't treated with chloramine and other crap, but I do have to endure calcium stains and I cannot recommend it. My country of Sweden probably also uses less garbage in the tap water than for instance the US. Segment 3. Vivarium Setup. 3.1. Dry feet, wet back. Before getting into the details of how to set up your vivarium, I will introduce the concept dry feet, wet back. A common misconception is that dart frogs want a soaking wet and extremely humid environment, since they come from the jungle. You often imagine a vivarium with the ground entirely covered in moss, perhaps it would have a large waterfall and a pond as well, and a humidity that is constantly 100% with fog and condensation everywhere. However, anyone who has actually been to the rainforest will notice that the forest floor is covered in dead leaves, which actually dry up fairly quickly between rainfalls. The frogs aren't constantly sitting on drenched moss, but rather on leaves, rocks and logs on the ground. It can obviously get very wet when it rains, but it's not constantly soaking wet everywhere all the time. Dart frogs are also animals that won't swim around in large water features, like for instance a fire-bellied toadwood, but rather they are terrestrial animals that live almost exclusively on land. This is the basis for the saying that dart frogs want dry feet and a wet back. While the relative humidity coming from above is quite high, there should also be plenty of dry surfaces in the enclosure. The rainforest understory is not a swamp, and if you want to replicate their natural environment, we need to keep this in mind. 3.2. Background and hardscape. When it comes to vivarium backgrounds, there is plenty of room for creativity. It is common to make custom 3D backgrounds out of expanding foam and/or styrofoam, cover them in aquarium silicone, and squeeze dry cocoa fiber into the silicone to make it look like a dirt slope or something. You can also integrate various branches into the foam background if you're using expanding foam. However, I personally don't put that much effort into my backgrounds. This is partially because I'm lazy, and partially because with the way that I set up and plant my vivariums, the plants will eventually take over everything anyways, so there's not really a need for a fancy 3D background. I always use one of two options, Hygralon or corkbark panels, and with both materials, I just attach them straight to the glass using aquarium silicone. Hygralon is a synthetic mesh designed to mimic bark, with the way it holds and lifts an appropriate amount of moisture, but doesn't become soaking wet. When using this mesh, I put it so it goes all the way to the bottom of the tank, so it can suck up moisture from the drainage layer. This is by far the background option that has given me the best plant growth. Corkbark panels are another great option. I like to scratch up the surface using some random tools to make it look less flat and more natural, and if you buy the thick panels, you have even more freedom to carve out whatever shapes you like. A third option you can go for is tree fern panels, but they tend to be rather expensive. I have previously used cocoa fiber carpet or cocoa fiber liner, but I don't recommend it at all, because its water transportation properties are rather strange. At first, they are almost hydrophobic, but the parts that stay in constant moisture and actually do moisten up will instead fall apart within a few years. You might ask yourself, is a background even necessary in a vivarium? And that's a great question. They generally have two purposes. To stop light from coming in from all sides of the enclosure, making the frogs feel more secure and less exposed, and to give the plants something to climb up against and utilize the height of the enclosure. The first purpose can be accomplished with a black trash bag taped to the back of the tank or something, while the second purpose is more dependent on the background actually being inside the enclosure. I would argue that to fully utilize any vivarium that's more than 18 inches tall, it is necessary to have something for the plants to climb up against if you want to fully utilize the height of the enclosure. That also goes for any tanks with more height than depth, such as these ones. I do have a few tanks without backgrounds, all of which are very narrow and extremely deep, which makes it easy to escape them in a way so that the frogs can feel secure regardless. However, if these tanks were the same size, but instead were wide and shallow, the whole enclosure would feel flat like a canvas in comparison, the frogs would be much more exposed, and a background would, in my opinion, be almost completely necessary. Besides the background, I usually also have some hardscape pieces in my vivariums. Corkbark tubes and corkbark branches are lightweight and easy to place in the tank, but they will break down eventually. Harder wood types, like mangrove or driftwood from aquarium stores, are also great options. If possible, I prefer to keep branches and wood pieces loose, so that I can remove them in the future if I need to catch a frog or re-escape the tank, but you can of course also integrate them into the background. If you don't have a background, or if your background is just a flat hygrolon piece or something, it becomes extra important to squeeze in as many hardscape elements as possible. If you can scape and plant your tank so that half the ground level is covered in shadows, then you really know that your frogs are going to feel safe and secure in there. A really good recommendation, both when it comes to making the vivarium background and other things like planting, is to watch as many vivarium build videos as possible. I have a playlist with a few of my own builds on this channel, but there is plenty of other content out there for you to discover. 3.3 Water features. It's common for beginners to imagine that a water feature is an essential part of a dart frog vivarium, but this couldn't be further from the truth. In general, dart frogs are exclusively land animals and won't utilize a water feature at all to swim around in, so it essentially just takes away from the valuable and already limited land area in the tank, so the frogs get less usable space. There are also many risks of practical things going wrong, such as the substrate getting saturated from a misdirected water flow or a leaking water barrier and turning the whole tank into a swamp, difficulty maintaining a good humidity and moisture balance, or bacterial growth due to stagnant water and difficulties keeping the water clean. It is often also claimed that dart frogs cannot swim at all and will drown, but this claim doesn't really hold up. If it's set up properly, it is possible to have a small water feature if the tank is really large and still has enough land area for the frogs, but it's only for your sake and not really for the frogs. I recently made an extensive video all about this issue, and if you're seriously considering a water feature, I highly suggest you to check that out first, since I go into a lot more detail there, but the short summary is that it's completely useless, it takes away space from the frogs since they won't utilize it, it can cause many practical issues if it's not set up properly, and it adds an extra level of difficulty in setting up the tank, so I highly urge beginners to skip it. Some keepers use a water dish in their enclosure, while other keepers never do. I usually don't, since they tend to get dirty very quickly and end up just being a death trap for fruit flies, but try adding one to see what you think, since you can always remove it. If you have a good humidity balance in the tank in general, and perhaps some bromeliads with water-filled leaf axils, this shouldn't be necessary. If you do use a water dish, make sure to clean it quite often, to avoid harmful bacterial growth. 3.4 Drainage layer. To set up the bottom part of your vivarium, you have two options. The most conventional method is to use a drainage layer, a barrier and a substrate mix. The other method, which has become increasingly popular lately, is to instead use filter foam, which serves as both the substrate and the drainage layer at once. I will get back to the filter foam later, but let's first talk about the normal option. You need a layer in the bottom of the tank where excess water can collect without coming into direct contact with the substrate. I normally use clay balls, but you can use anything that's not organic and won't break down while in constant contact with water. I highly recommend something lightweight, because if you use gravel or pebbles, your tank will get insanely heavy. You also need a way to drain excess water from the drainage layer before the water level rises and comes into contact with the substrate layer. Here you have two options. The best option is to drill the bottom of the tank so the excess water drains automatically through a bulkhead, through a hose and into a bucket or something. This requires some extra initial effort, but is probably worth it. The other option is to have a drainage pipe, or in other words, a place where you can access the water from the drainage layer and siphon out the water. You can use a PVC pipe, but I prefer using the top half of a plastic bottle instead, since it has a screw cap lid to seal it off and keep frogs out of there. Make sure there are no cables or substrate inside of the pipe, since you want to be able to access the water. Once the water level rises, simply stick down a hose, suck in the other end, and siphon out water thanks to the wonderful laws of physics. This is a good option for 1 or 2 tanks, but manually draining your tanks can become tedious if you have a large collection. I have heard. On top of your drainage layer, you will need a barrier so that substrate won't fall down there. I use black geotextile fabric, but you can also use some type of mesh. The most important thing is that you use something that won't break down. 3.5. Substrate. In the humid environment, that is a dart frog tank, I think it's very important to have a substrate that 1. Has a chunky structure with large pieces and plenty of air pockets, 2. Holds an appropriate amount of moisture and drains well, and 3. Will last for a long time without turning into a compact, soaking wet mud. With a good substrate mix, you most likely won't have to replace the substrate at all within the next 10 to 15 years. The best way to achieve a good substrate is usually to have a mix of different ingredients of different particle sizes. One common and famous mixture is ABG mix, a substrate mix developed at the Atlanta Botanical Garden, hence the name. By now, almost every substrate mix is called ABG mix online, but it's only real ABG if it contains plenty of tree fern fibers, which is apparently the main reason it lasts for so long. However, I personally don't use ABG mix. In fact, I have never tried the real thing with the tree fern fibers in it. My substrate mix, that I have used for several years now in slightly different versions, is mainly based on bark, either quote-unquote reptile bark or quote-unquote orchid bark, and pumice. The bark will usually last for a very long time, but it's still an organic material that will release some nutrients over time. The pumice, on the other hand, greatly improves drainage as well as increasing evaporation from the substrate, meaning that you can mist the vivarium much more without the substrate becoming soaking wet. The fact that the pumice is non-organic also means that it will basically last forever. I usually also mix in about 10% biochar, which supposedly helps purify the water and absorbs nutrients to re-release them over time. Another option, which I think works quite well, is to solely use bark without mixing anything else into it. This is one of the few substrates that can be used on its own, since it usually lasts for a very long time, is chunky and filled with air pockets, and contains some nutrients. A completely different route, which is very trendy nowadays, is to use filter foam that acts as both the drainage layer and the substrate at once. It's very much possible to grow plants in this material, even though the common sense instincts of most beginners say otherwise. The filter foam stays humid, and you will have a few centimeters of standing water at the bottom, but of course it won't ever break down or anything. When using a very generous layer of leaf litter, and perhaps a bit of live moss on top of the foam, you also provide somewhere for the springtails and isopods to live, and once that leaf litter breaks down, it releases nutrients into the foam. In general, I always stay away from using any fine-grained organic materials, in other words soil, whether that be potting soil, fine-grained coconut fiber, or fine-grained peats. This is because it tends to get waterlogged, become very compact, and simply break down into a soggy and anaerobic mud when it's kept moist for an extended time. If you remember the dry feet wet back concept from before, this is obviously not a good thing, so if you can accurately describe your substrate mix with the word soil, it's probably not a good mix in the long run. I also avoid using large portions of dead, rehydrated moss in my substrate mixes, since that typically breaks down somewhat quickly as well. and once it does, the substrate will become much more compact. Using maybe 10 to 15% soil or dead rehydrated moss in your substrate mix can be a good idea, since it will release some nutrients and give a good initial boost for your plants when it breaks down, but using larger portions of these materials just tends to shorten the lifespan of your substrate in my experience. An old piece of advice, which is unfortunately still perpetuated by some sources, is to use a layer of dead, rehydrated sphagnum moss on top of your substrate. This is an outdated and horrible practice, because when the sphagnum gets misted extensively and covered in frog poop, it will become soaking wet, turn gross, and become a perfect breeding ground for bacteria and risk causing infections for the frogs sitting in it. The origin of this recommendation is that it would help maintain the humidity and cool the enclosure down back when every light source produced a lot more spill heat and the hobby hadn't really figured out that limiting the ventilation had such a strong effect on increasing the humidity. But now it's completely unnecessary, as it's so easy to maintain the humidity through other means, and it therefore adds more risks than benefits. Having a carpet of living moss is not as bad as a layer of dead moss, since it at least won't break down and become a breeding ground for bacteria, but I would still make sure there are also some areas in the tank covered with leaf litter instead, considering the dry feet wet back concept. 3.6. Leaf litter. Regardless if you're using filter foam or loose substrate, you should definitely top it off with a layer of leaf litter, to recreate the rainforest understory where the frogs live in the wild. I use beech leaves and European oak leaves because they don't break down or get mushy as quickly as many other leaves do, and I usually collect them myself. Other popular, long-lasting options include live oak and magnolia, and what you can find obviously depends on what part of the world you're living in. You can also order fancy leaf litter online. I always boil the leaves for 10 minutes to avoid bringing spiders and slugs into my tanks, and then I spread them out on some newspaper to let them dry for a few days. The leaf litter will have to be replenished every few months, since it does eventually break down even if you use the good leaf types. 3.7. Planting. A common question is if you can use fake plants in a dart frog vivarium, or if real plants are a necessity. My answer is always that if you're unable to keep some relatively easy plants alive in your enclosure, it's definitely not a suitable environment for dart frogs. Real plants also have the benefit of increasing the humidity in the tank, and they will transform the tank completely when they grow, so for me, the plants are just as fun as the frogs themselves. In my tanks, I generally use around 8 different types of plants. These are background plants, bromeliads, aroids, begonias, random vines, ferns, orchids, and moss. I'm quite a plant enthusiast, so I will happily spend time, money, and energy into collecting different rare species. But if you just want a lush and green enclosure so your frogs can be happy, there are plenty of commonly available plants that you can use that work just as well. Golden pothos, Monstera adansonii, Philodendron hederaceum, and Tradescantia sabrina are great examples of easy plants to care for that will grow insanely quickly in a humid dart frog tank. I also recommend some small-leaved climbing plants that will cover the background, and if you're new to plants and don't know where to start, the best plant you can get is Ficus pumila, which grows insanely well as long as it's placed in a moist enough spot, and can turn the entire enclosure into a beautiful jungle completely on its own, give it enough time. That said, once you get past a certain point, you might get tired of these plant species since they grow quite quickly and might choke out other plants, especially the Ficus and the Tradescantia. Bromeliads are also popular choices in vivariums due to their water-filled leaf axils, but they aren't a necessity in your enclosure. With almost all vining plants, I usually plant them in the substrate and lean them against the background so they can climb up against it over time. But with bromeliads and epiphytic orchids, you will have most success planting them epiphytically, meaning on top of the background or hardscape, since that's how they grow in nature. You will most likely end up trying plenty of different plant species and planting styles before figuring out how you want it. A few months ago, I made a really comprehensive guide to vivarium plants, so that's why I haven't really gone into too much detail in this segment. I highly recommend you to watch that video once you're done with this one, because it covers absolutely everything as far as the plants are concerned. In that video, I give you detailed descriptions and tips and tricks for each plant type, showcase a massive number of plant species suitable for the vivarium, and show you how to propagate plants, how to plant epiphytes, and how to quarantine new plants. 3.8 Microfauna. In a bioactive vivarium, you introduce a so-called cleanup crew of various bugs that will help you keep the enclosure clean, and the most famous of which are springtails, which primarily take care of mold. While there are many species of springtails, most people just use the standard white Folsomia candida. There are also many tropical isopods that take care of dead leaves and other organic materials in the tank. With isopods, I would say that the smaller species, such as tropical white and dwarf purple isopods, are much more effective and useful in the vivarium than the larger and faster species, such as the Cuban isopods, and they also thrive and reproduce better in my experience, but you can try some of the large ones too for fun. In any bioactive vivarium, there will eventually be an entire ecosystem of bacteria, microbes, fungi, and other organisms that just find their way into the setups in some unknown way. Sometimes you will even have little mushrooms popping up occasionally. 3.9 Humidity. I like to see humidity and moisture level as two different things, with humidity being the number you would read on a functional hygrometer and moisture being how moist the surface is in the vivarium stay. A keyword there is functional hygrometer, because most hygrometers are complete garbage and cannot be trusted, especially in a rainforest vivarium where the instrument itself often gets wet. Anyways, back to the point I was making. You can have a very low humidity despite having a soaking wet swamp at the bottom of the tank, or a high humidity despite having bone dry leaves on top of your substrate. The difference between those outcomes usually comes down to how much ventilation you have in the tank. The goal is to keep the humidity quite high while not soaking the entire tank. In other words, dry feet, wet back. I would guess that the humidity in my vivariums fluctuates between 70 and 95%, but it's difficult to say exactly, because I don't measure the humidity at all. Instead, I completely eyeball it, depending on the moisture level in the tank. If you can find plenty of moisture here and there in the top half of the enclosure, like around plants, on branches, and sometimes condensation on parts of the glass, while the layer of leaf litter still gets to dry up between mistings and your substrate doesn't get soaked, then that's a sign you have a good humidity and moisture balance throughout the tank, and you will quickly develop a feeling for this. If you're struggling with the humidity and moisture balance, it's probably because you have too much, or in a few cases too little ventilation, which I explained in chapter 2.2 of this video. 3.10 Cycling. It's often recommended to wait for a while after setting up your enclosure before you get your frogs, similar to how you would let an aquarium cycle before adding fish. It's to let the plants grow in, let the cleanup crew establish itself, let the humidity stabilize itself, and notice errors. You might find very different opinions on how much time is necessary, ranging from a few days to many months, but in my opinion, it's entirely on a case-by-case basis. In my experience, the cleanup crew will establish themselves quite well, even if you immediately add frogs. However, sometimes you get a mold outbreak in the beginning, which will usually go away quickly as the springtails take care of it, but it might be a good idea to let this happen before adding frogs. Letting the plants establish themselves and start growing a little bit is a much better reason to cycle your vivarium. I usually only start with small cuttings rather than large plants, since I think a plant grown from a cutting in the enclosure will look much better and more natural in the long run than a massive squeezed-in plant, but that has the side effect that my freshly planted vivariums have very little plant coverage for the frogs in the beginning, which is why I typically wait for quite a long time in most cases. A bold Dendrobates tinctorius probably won't care that much, but a shy Renitomea certainly would. You also get more time to change things around, since you don't really want to do that too much with frogs in there. The humidity also increases a great deal as the plants start establishing themselves in the tank. The last reason to cycle your vivarium is to notice any mistakes, and I would say that this is the most important reason if you're new to the hobby. It can be anything. Maybe you went with a bad substrate mix, maybe half your plants died because you planted them in the wrong spots, maybe the humidity won't stay high enough, or maybe the light you're using gets too hot and heats up the enclosure to dangerous temperatures. Some people pretty much get it right on their first try, while others, like me, have a great deal of trouble with their first enclosure in the beginning, and I'm very thankful I didn't add frogs immediately. I would say that waiting for about a month is a good rule of thumb, especially if you're a beginner. But if it feels like the setup is ready, you can add animals before that, and if you have the patience to wait even longer, that's not a bad thing. Segment 4. Regular care and maintenance. 4.1. Feeder insects. Feeder insects are a major part of keeping dart frogs, and are one of the main reasons people quit the hobby or hesitate to get into it. This is because most of them require regularly making new cultures, rather than just throwing food at them like you would if you bred roaches or something. However, once you get the routine down, it's not that bad if you ask me. Something important to know is that dart frogs only eat very small prey items relative to their own size, unlike most other frogs that will take fewer but significantly larger prey items. The main feeder insects are flightless fruit flies, and it's difficult to get by without them, since they are by far the feeder insects that it's easiest to reliably and consistently produce large quantities of. To culture fruit flies, you will put in some dry media in a cup, mix it with water, and put in some cardboard, excelsior or coffee filters for the maggots to pupate on, and finally add a few flies. Then the flies will lay eggs that hatch into larvae, and in 2 to 3 weeks the culture will start booming with new flies for a while until it eventually dies off. You will have to get used to making new fruit fly cultures roughly once every week or every 2 weeks, and I highly recommend it to start culturing fruit flies before purchasing your first frogs, in case your first cultures crash, since it's much better to have feeders but no frogs than to have frogs but no feeders. There are 2 types of fruit flies, the small Drosophila melanogaster and the large Drosophila hydei, and out of those I would recommend focusing mainly on the small melanogaster, since they are a bit easier and they work for almost all dart frogs, including most froglets except super tiny ones. If you're not keeping the really large and ferocious dart frog species, there's not really a big reason to also keep hydei. I have an entire video on how to culture fruit flies where I go into more detail, such as showcasing my fruit fly media recipe and so on. That video is linked in the top right corner of the screen and in the description. Springtails are a great food source. They are probably already part of your cleanup crew, as I mentioned before, but I highly recommend also having a separate culture that you can feed from. I keep mine in plastic tubs on 1 to 2 cm of hardly packed moist peat. Then I feed them with dry yeast every other day or so. The key is to feed them a little at a time and do it really often, rather than feeding them rarely and much. To harvest them, I put a piece of the lid of an egg carton in the tank and feed them on top of it, so they all climb onto it, and then I can just shake them into a cup. Aphids are also a good way to vary the diet, and most aphids are specialized on one plant species and will therefore not go after your vivarium plants. In the summer, you can pick them from elder bushes, artichokes and other infected plants outside, as long as you avoid branches sprayed with pesticides or areas close to busy roads. In the European hobby, it's common to culture pea aphids or vetch aphids, which you can culture by planting some peas every week, lighting them up for 12 to 14 hours a day, and letting aphids infect the young plants. I actually made a video on pea aphids last year, but since making that video, I have replaced them with vetch aphids, which aren't as messy because they don't leave as much sticky residue around them, but I care for the vetch aphids in the exact same way, including keeping them on pea plants. There are also many other feeder insects you can use. Many keepers, for instance, have separate isopod cultures that they feed from. I recently started culturing bean beetles to vary the diet from my larger species, and they are extremely easy to culture, but apparently they aren't good as a main food source because of their high chitin content. Pinhead crickets can also work for the large dart frog species. The larger frogs from the Phyllobates and Ameriga genus are generally much more ferocious and will take on slightly larger prey items relative to their own size, such as medium-sized crickets. However, the same doesn't apply to the similarly sized Dendrobates species that still prefer fruit flies and other small insects. I have mentioned many different types of feeders now, but how many of these do you actually need? You will come a long way with only melanogaster fruit flies, and for several years I only used them without culturing any other feeders besides the cleanup crew that was already in my vivariums. However, I highly recommend at least trying out springtails, and if you feel like it, maybe also aphids or bean beetles or something, because it's quite nice to be able to vary their diet and have a backup food source. With a high number of bigger dart frogs, having the larger hydei fruit flies is also quite nice, since you can produce larger volumes of food more easily. 4.2. Feeding the frogs. I recommend feeding adult dart frogs around 2 to 5 times per week, while juveniles that are still growing should be fed 6 to 7 times per week, since their growth is very dependent on a consistent food supply. An adult and established dart frog can usually be fine for a week without being fed if it's a one-time thing, especially if you have a healthy microfauna in the tank that they can eat from, but you definitely don't want froglets to go that long without being fed. The exact amount that you feed them each time is difficult to say, but the general rule of thumb that can be applicable in many cases is that you should feed them with so many flies that there are a few left in the tank until the next feeding. You will of course also base it on how fat or thin the frogs are, and you will quickly get a feeling for how much you should feed to keep your frogs at a healthy weight but not obese. To feed your frogs with fruit flies, you can simply take a plastic cup, put some vitamins at the bottom, start tapping the fruit fly cup, open it up and tilt it to the side over the vitamin cup while you keep tapping it. Once the flies are covered in supplements, they lose the ability to climb, so now you can distribute them across your vivariums with no issues. 4.3. Supplements. The nutritional value of fruit flies themselves is rather low, so it's essential that you dust them in a good supplement mix. Most people currently consider Repashy Calcium Plus to be the best all-in-one supplement out there, and Dendrocare is another popular alternative. Frogs that are breeding can benefit from some extra vitamin A, so many keepers give their breeding frogs Repashy Vitamin A Plus once or twice a month, but don't give it to them more often than that, since you can overdose vitamin A. Some also mix in Repashy Super Pig once or twice a month for frogs that are red or orange, to help maintain their colors, since it contains carotenoids. Many of the supplement brands out there are of rather low quality and don't contain everything the frogs need in the right proportions, so don't buy the first random thing you find that happens to say Reptile and Calcium on the package. If you end up going with something besides Repashy Calcium Plus or Dendrocare, I would do plenty of research first. It's important that you store opened supplement bottles in the fridge and replace them after 6 months, since the vitamins do oxidize and lose their effectiveness over time. You can store supplements in the freezer for longer durations if you cannot use up the whole bottle fast enough. 4.4. Vivarium upkeep. The upkeep of a bioactive vivarium is rather simple, since you don't really need to do much besides keeping it looking good. The main tasks for me are trimming the plants every few months or whenever they have grown too much, and cleaning the glass from dirt and calcium stains. To get rid of calcium stains from the glass, I wipe the glass with citric acid and then with normal water to get rid of the acid. I also mentioned earlier that the leaf litter has to be replenished every few months. Obviously the water reservoir for the misting system also has to be refilled regularly, and if you haven't drilled the bottom of the tank, you will have to siphon out water from the drainage layer every once in a while. If you have a water dish in your enclosure, it will also have to be cleaned almost daily in some cases. These really are minor tasks that don't take up much time at all once the tank is set up. For me, the daily husbandry of my whole collection only takes around 20 minutes and consists of feeding the frogs, misting a few enclosures that don't have a misting system on them, and then on the weekends I'll make new fruit fly cultures and spend a couple of hours doing various miscellaneous tasks. 4.5. Handleability. Dart frogs are obviously not animals you should handle when it's not necessary, due to their sensitive skin. When you're moving a frog from one enclosure to another, I find that the easiest way is to take a small plastic cup and try to chase the frog into it. Misting the cup slightly first so the surface is moist is a good idea. Sometimes it's really easy and other times the frogs don't want to cooperate at all. I don't bother with rubber gloves or anything, and I honestly don't even know if they would do more harm or good. But if you know that you're going to try to catch a frog, I recommend washing your hands without soap right before, so they are just a bit moist. If I'm doing maintenance in the tank and a frog jumps out on the floor when I'm unprepared, I will obviously just catch it as quickly as possible with my hands, even if I don't have a catch cup ready. It's better to get it back into the tank as soon as possible, even if the catching method is suboptimal, rather than to risk it getting away while you go and wash your hands or find a catch cup. Segment 5. Choosing and buying frogs. 5.1. Scientific names, localities, numbers and abbreviations. As you have heard throughout the video, I only refer to different Dartfrog species by their scientific names, which every single species has. It's a two-word name, where the first word represents the genus and the second word represents the species, and here are a few examples. These might seem complicated to memorize, but you definitely have to learn to use them, because the common names of Dartfrog species are extremely misleading due to incredible variation within each species. Many Dartfrog species also have several slightly or extremely different color variations. These are not man-made morphs like those seen in ball pythons or leopard geckos, but rather naturally occurring varieties from different geographic regions in the wild, sometimes with ranges separated by just a few kilometers or opposite banks of a river. In the hobby, such a population is referred to as a locality or locale. Pretty much all Dartfrog variants in the hobby are localities, which is sometimes reflected in the name. For example, Ranitme imitator Kainarachi is named after the Kainarachi Valley in Peru. In some cases, however, the frog's origin isn't clear from the name. For example, Dendrobates auratus superblue. This is either because the exact origin is unknown, intentionally kept secret, or has been replaced by a widely used trade name. Still, these forms are also and should also be treated as localities and not as man-made crosses. The Dartfrog community unanimously strives to preserve these localities within the hobby, so due to the risk of crossbreeding, different localities of the same species should not be housed together, and the same goes for different but closely related species. If we start mixing, it will eventually be hard to keep track of what we have, and nature has already provided us with plenty of beautiful frogs, so there is no need to start crossing them. When frogs are being listed for sale, there are often three numbers attached to them like this. The first number is the number of males, the second is the number of females, and the third is the number of unsexed frogs, which are usually juveniles. So 1.2.4 is 1 male, 2 females, and 4 unsexed frogs. Two important abbreviations are CB, which stands for captive bred, and WC, which stands for wild caught. You should absolutely buy captive bred frogs, because you will have much higher chances of success and less risk for disease. In some countries, keeping wild-caught Dartfrogs is also illegal. Wild-caught frogs are rare when it comes to most of the common species, since it's not worth catching wild frogs when it's easier and cheaper to breed them. But some notable exceptions are the sheep Ophago pumilio in US pet stores, which are always wild-caught. Another useful abbreviation is PB, which stands for proven breeder and means that a pair or group of frogs has produced offspring in some previous owner's care. 5.2 Beginner-friendly species. I know this is the 6th or 7th time in this video that I'm plugging another video of mine, but I made an extensive overview of pretty much all beginner-friendly Dartfrogs in a video last year, covering all their respective pros and cons and notable attributes, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here. When it's time for you to choose your first frog, I highly recommend you to check out that video instead. Still, I will try to give you a really short introduction to some of the most common beginner-friendly species here too. A beginner-friendly Dartfrog should be somewhat hardy, so it doesn't die because of the slightest mistake. When it's your first frog specifically, I also recommend a species that's pretty bold, since keeping shy frogs can be extremely stressful once you're brand new and haven't gotten too confident in your husbandry yet. You also have to be aware of whether the species you want does well in groups or not, and whether it has a loud or quiet call. Okay, time to speedrun through these species. 3, 2, 1, go. The Dendrobates genus is the most common genus to start with, as they are generally hardy and tolerant. Dendrobates leucomelas is a beloved classic and a relatively bold frog, and it's the only species in the genus that has a loud call, while the rest have a quiet buzzing sound. Dendrobates tinctorius is a very variable frog that is known to be extremely bold and unafraid, making it a great display frog or first frog, but they unfortunately don't do well in groups as adults, since females can be quite territorial. The others in the genus can usually be kept in groups, but the females can sometimes be problematic with them too. Dendrobates auratus is about as variable as tinctorius, but they aren't always as bold, and it's somewhat of a gamble whether you get bold or shy individuals. Dendrobates truncatus also exists, and is probably similar to auratus. Next we have the Phyllobates genus. They almost always do well in groups without issues, and have a loud call. Phyllobates terribilis and Phyllobates bicolor are large and super bold, awesome display frogs that you can always see, while Phyllobates vittatus and Arutinea are a bit smaller and can sometimes be fairly shy, especially as juveniles. There is also Phyllobates lugubris, which is even smaller and much less common. Epipodobates anthonii is, in my opinion, probably the easiest dart frog of them all to keep and breed, and they are moderately bold and really fun to keep in groups. I like to call them the guppies of the dart frog hobby. However, their call is extremely loud, and they will call a lot more frequently than some other species. Epipodobates tricolor is similar, but much less common. Starting with the Ranitomea species is feasible, but they are generally considered intermediate due to their small size, and I would only go for a Ranitomea as a first frog if you're really specifically interested in them. Some Ranitomeas can sometimes be ridiculously shy and might literally hide for weeks, especially if they aren't that happy with escaping and planting of their enclosure, and this is of course not so nice as a beginner keeper. I would say that the two sister species, Ranitomea variabilis and Amazonica, are probably among the best suited for beginners in the genus, since they are usually bold, have a good appetite, and do really well in groups. An honorable mention from a genus that I don't have any personal experience with is Adelphobates galactonodus. And well, that was it for my super quick overview, and now I will start speaking a bit more slowly again. To go into far more detail and see many more localities of each species, watch the video I mentioned earlier. 5.3. How many frogs should you get? The number of frogs you can keep together varies greatly depending on what species you choose and of course the vivarium size. Most of the beginner-friendly dart frogs I mentioned earlier do fairly well in groups, except for Dendrobates tinctorius, where the females are very territorial. Other species that are known to often do poorly in groups are Ophaga species and Ranitomea imitator, and with these species it tends to be the males that are aggressive instead of the females, but my experience with them is limited. To give you some rough, common sense estimations of group sizes, I will use a 45 by 45 by 60 cm or 18 by 18 by 24 inch enclosure as a baseline and tell you how many frogs I would keep in there. Some people might disagree on the exact number of frogs, and there is of course no reason to try to overcrowd your vivariums. Even with the species that work in groups, it is always possible to keep a pair or a single frog too. With Dendrobates tinctorius, it's best to only keep a pair or possibly a male-heavy trio, almost regardless of the vivarium size, since adult females usually don't get along even in bigger tanks. If you cannot find sexed frogs, it's common to buy 3 to 5 unsexed juveniles, grow them up until they are adults, and then keep a working pair and sell or trade the rest. Other species from the Dendrobates genus tend to do better in groups than Tinctorius, so 3 to 4 frogs is totally reasonable to keep in that tank size, but keep an eye out for aggression, especially among females. Females also tend to eat or destroy each other's eggs. Aim for a male-heavy or balanced group if it's possible. Phyllobates species tend to have no issues at all in groups, regardless of the sex ratio, and I would feel more comfortable housing them in higher numbers than I would with Dendrobates. That said, they're still large terrestrial frogs, and the tank size I mentioned isn't massive, so around 3 to 4 frogs seems most reasonable for it. In an enclosure with more floor space, that number can easily be increased a lot. Epipodobates anthonii is a very fun frog to keep in groups, and 4 to 6 frogs in that tank should be completely fine. There will be occasional fighting between males, but usually nothing that has any serious consequences. The group tolerance within the Ranitomea genus varies a bit between species, so I would say around 2 to 4 frogs depending on the species. With the most group-friendly ones, you could consider trying 5 to 6, but I would usually just start with 4. In this segment, I have only really considered adult frogs. Juveniles can be kept in smaller vivariums, and you can keep significantly more frogs per area unit, since juveniles are not territorial in the same way that adults are. 5.4. Can you keep different species together? Mixing dart frog species is a controversial topic, but new keepers are always advised against trying it. There are several reasons for this. Number 1. You want to avoid hybridization between closely related species and crossbreeding between locales within a species. Different species within the same genus can in many cases produce fertile offspring together, despite the definition of a species explicitly saying otherwise, simply because amphibian taxonomy is very messy. Number 2, you can have issues with fighting between territorial frogs, especially with the species known to be more territorial, but also with others. This will of course stress out the frogs. Number 3, there can often be an uneven distribution of food among the frogs if the species are differently quote-unquote good at eating. A ferocious Dendrobates stinctorius will leave no fruit flies behind for a shy Ranitomea species that hides for an hour after the tank was last opened. If one species is better at eating, the other will often lose weight very quickly. Number 4, different species can in some cases have different requirements for their environment. And number 5, you can spread diseases between different species. There are sort of ways to get around these issues with a well thought out combination of species, and I discussed this question from a much more nuanced perspective in my video Can you keep different dart frogs together? But in general, if you want to try it, you should have plenty of experience under your belt. A common saying, which is slightly elitist but still has some value, is that if you have to ask about whether to mix species or not, you probably shouldn't attempt it yet, since you don't have the necessary experience to pull it off successfully. 5.5. Buying frogs. Make sure that you buy your dart frogs from a good seller. All of my frogs are from other private breeders that, like myself, just keep frogs as a passion and get some froglets in the process. Usually, you get in touch through local community marketplace websites. There are also some reputable larger companies in the business, but keep in mind that there are many shady actors in the field as well that don't take proper care of their animals and sell too young, sick or hybridized frogs. The fact that someone has a lot of animals doesn't mean that they know what they're doing. A few years ago, scammers on Facebook that stole other people's frog photos to try to get you to send them money was also a major issue. If you buy the super young and skinny frogs from the shitty stores like Petco and PetSmarts, or whatever the equivalent in your country is, it might seem like you're saving the frogs from the store's horrible husbandry in the process, but all it's really doing is supporting the store and incentivizing them to buy more dart frogs. It's very important that froglets you buy or sell are old enough, since moving to a new home is stressful for the frogs, and older, more established frogs tend to handle it much better than young ones. I think a good minimum age to sell your frogs is generally around 3 to 4 months, and definitely not below 2 months. However, if you're selling frogs openly to random people at an expo or beginners that are new to the hobby, I honestly think that you'll be giving them a much better chance of success if you sell froglets that are 6 months old or more. So if you as a seller have the opportunity to hold on to them for a bit longer, that's great. Preparing a suitable transport cup for the frogs should be entirely the seller's responsibility, though I do have a video about that if you're curious. But if you're going on a trip in hot or cold weather to pick up the frogs, you as the buyer should ideally bring a styrofoam box to keep the temperature stable during the ride. If you're located in Sweden, you have to check out our community in the Swedish Dendrobates Society and our forum plift.se. We arrange frog days twice a year where you can meet me and the rest of the Swedish community and buy everything you need for your hobby. I will leave all of our links in the description. I know the Netherlands also has an association and their own frog days, and I've seen some frog days and meetups in the US as well. If you don't have an association near you, you might still be able to find a local Facebook group, and even though Facebook has banned the sale of live animals on their platform, you should be able to get in touch with people there. Finding a local community and meeting like-minded people in your area has many other advantages, even before it's time to actually buy your frogs. After watching this video, you should have a good grasp of all the basics, but I still have to say that visiting a fellow dart frog collector in real life can often teach you a lot more than hours and hours of researching online. Most of them are very friendly and happy to show off their collection and sell you some cheap fruit fly cultures or a cheap, generous package of plant cuttings. 5.6. CITES and your responsibilities. All dart frogs are listed under Appendix 2 of CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. Now, I'm not a lawyer or anything, so please don't take the legal details of what I say too seriously, but I'll just try my best to give you a general overview of the situation. Dart frogs being listed under Appendix 2 means two things in practice. 1. You typically need a CITES export permit and sometimes a CITES import permit whenever you're bringing them across a border. Though an exception is that trade within the European Union is generally treated the same as trade within a single country, meaning it's a bit easier. This is something I know very little about and shouldn't give advice on, but basically, imports and exports need some legal efforts. 2. When trading within a country, you still have to be able to prove that the animal has a legal background through some documentation. Different countries may have different views on what classifies as sufficient proof, so please do some research on this yourself within your local community, but here in Sweden, the requirement is to at least have a breeder certificate for each frog. These certificates have to provide information about the frog's species and age, as well as who bred the frog and information about who bred the parent animals. As a seller, always include a breeder certificate, and as a buyer, make sure to verify that you're getting sufficient documentation. I don't know if the common routine with breeder certificates is the same in the US as it is here in the EU, but it's not that hard to just write a certificate. That was it for my complete dart frog care guide. Let me know in the comment section if there's anything I missed, something you disagree about, or if you have any further questions. I spent a very long time working on this video, so it would mean a lot to me if you could give me just a little something back by subscribing to the channel, pressing the notification bell so you don't miss out on any future uploads, giving the video a like, and sharing it with a couple of friends. All of those things are completely free and it only takes you a few seconds, but it still goes such a long way to support me. If you want to support my channel even more, I recently started a merch store where you can buy awesome t-shirts, hoodies, mugs and caps. Check it out in the description. I also started a Discord server where you can talk to me and other community members to ask for advice and get some behind the scenes sneak peeks of what's to come on the channel. Finally, as always, you can follow me on my Instagram at gecko_geek06 if you want to see more of my animal room. Thank you so much for watching this video and staying until the end, and I hope I see you in the next one.